Chapter 4. The Tower. Gabriella was shivering as they made their way around the harbor on the wagon road. The villagers had left the square for the tower so quickly that there had not been time to stop and dry their clothes by a fire. Now Gabriella took some solace in the mere fact that they were moving, which was better than standing still and shivering. But if it was bringing any warmth to her body, she did not sense it. Instead, she was painfully aware of each gust of wind from the harbor and every wet leaf lying in the road. They found Gabriella's parents in the crowd along the road. Her mother was not pleased to see her in Damien's damp clothes. "Whatever were you doing?" she asked in a scornful tone. Gabriella explained what had happened and how Mortimer Creedley had jumped in to save her brother. Gabriella's mother, Marissa, looked at her father, who rubbed his whiskers with his calloused hand and said, "I suppose we should give him a cask of wine in thanks of his heroics." "Mark," Gabriella's mother said, "drink is the last thing that man needs." "Then we should at least have him over for a meal," he said. "Sure," Gabriella said, because she knew she was expected to. But having that man with a penetrating stare and uncouth ways in their home made her uncomfortable. "That would be a proper gesture," her mother said. They made their way around the harbor, past fields ready for harvest. Pumpkins and squash waited, ripe and colorful and fat. Heads of cabbage had grown to full size, and the corn was high and plentiful. Some farms had already begun their harvest, gathering hay in piles for winter feed. But no one was in the fields now. Word had reached even those who had not been present dockside when the Sevor had arrived. Fields had emptied and homes were shut up while entire families joined the throngs marching down dark, well-worn paths to observe the ancient ritual at the tower. The villagers grew quiet as they turned off the road to take the winding trail through the section of land that was owned by Mab Miller. Gabriella listened to the whispers around her. "Surely he won't sell. He's a greedy man. The dead will smite him. What could these foreigners want with the tower?" There was no response for the last question, and it hung unanswered in the silence that grew as they neared the tower. First to change were the trees. The ubiquitous pines of Harkness gave way to Caledonian trees, their leaves blood red with the season. These trees grew along the harbor and were thickest around the shore of the tower. In winter, they would look gnarled and twisted without their leaves, like remnants of a forest fire. Yet even in that season, the shadows of the trees conspired so that the black tower seemed always cast in darkness. The loomy soil underfoot gave way to sand, but not the goldy, grainy stuff of ocean shore with which children build sandcastles. This sand was black as coal and suffocating. Nothing could grow in it. Not a sapling, not a single shoot of grass. Children did not play in it, and adults were forbidden to dig in it. Those who had found bones, thousands upon thousands of bones. Gabriella and her family rounded the end of the peninsula, and the tower rose up brooding. It was not tall. The highest conifers of the forest surpassed it. It was brutal in its simplicity. The black stones that made up its walls were irregular and mortarless, stacked tightly upon one another with sharp edges turned outward. There were no crenellations, no merlons or balustrades, only 2 plain windows and a single cypress door on the harbor side. The door was locked for the protection of anyone who tried to enter. Only the initiated, those consecrated to the gods and the dead, who were wise in their ways and privy to their secrets, could step within. Anyone else who did would die, or so it was said. In her lifetime, Gabriella had known no one to test the legend, but stories abounded of others in the distant past who dared to enter and never emerged alive. The arm of land that held the tower was already crowded with villagers. Some had even rowed across the harbor and waited offshore in boats. Others braved the cold and, removing their boots, sandals, or shoes, stood submerged in the water up to their knees, so determined were they not to be on the periphery of the coming ceremony. Gabriella and her family found a place close to the open ground where the summoning would take place. This suited Gabriella, for although the dancers, once they were possessed by the gods or spirits of the dead, scared her, she wanted to be close enough to hear any prophecies they might speak. She moved closer to her father, Glad was there, a head taller than other men with wide shoulders and large, powerful hands. She always felt safer in his company. As the sun oozed into a red band on the horizon and shadows grew, a novice priestess lit the lamp that indicated the presence of the dead. The village across the harbor and all the houses that lay between were dark. Gabriella had never seen so many villagers present for a summoning before. There were so many that there was a delay as the priestesses, and sanctified dancers had to make their way through the crowd to the tower, which they entered alone in order to prepare. They filed in one by one, ducking beneath the low lintel, their faces drawn and solemn, their footsteps slow and purposeful. Gabriella wished for expediency, for she was growing even colder now that the night had set in. Damien was unbothered. He was keeping to himself, drawing spirals in the sand with a stick. But Eloise's lips looked blue, and her teeth began to chatter. Gabriella was not much better. "I wish I had changed clothes," she said to her friend as she tried to wring out the sleeve of her shirt. "It's worse now that we're not walking." Eloise stamped her feet. A whistle sounded, the note soaring overhead, then descending to a lower register, signaling that the musicians were in place and ready. It was the starting note of the ceremony, a flare sent up to the gods to beseech their attention, a stone tossed into a sea of darkness to disturb the boundary between life and death. The drums followed, roaring to life like thunder, their pounding giving a heartbeat to the dead, inviting them back into the world of the living. Above and below, gods and spirits were called. The dancers, white robes swirling around them, emerged from the tower, a uniform line of motion. The identity of each dancer was obscured by a mask bearing the likeness of the god to whom he or she was sanctified. The dancers were villagers whom Gabriella knew. Everyone knew them, but beneath their robes and their masks, they were indistinguishable from one another. A few times Gabriella had thought she recognized a dancer. It was rumored that Chief Salinger's wife, Melaine, was a dancer, but no one spoke of it openly. To do so was improper. Gabriella knew many of the masks. There was Simiel the Sorrowful, a round face, round eyes, and agonized frown. Hydson the Joyous, who had similar features to Simiel, except for a mirthful laughing grin. There was Galbraith, quick to anger, whose face was carved with quiline severity. Dull, the Rememberer, with her long thoughtful countenance and narrow pensive eyes. A number of masks passed under the light of the torches that Gabriella did not recognize in the play of light and shadow. Then she recognized Hibben, the seer, and Quiwa, the trickster. The priests and priestesses in their white robes followed. It was their role to address the spirits when they possessed the bodies of the dancers. Former dancers themselves, they knew the rhythms and rites of the ceremony better than anyone. Only they were allowed to interpret the prophecies provided by the gods or the dead. Gabriella turned her attention to the ceremony, trying her best to forget the cold that was seeping into her bones. Her muscles felt rigid with shivers. She set her teeth against each other to still their chattering. Eloise was faring better. She had only waded into the river up to her waist and was not standing closer to the offering fire. When she saw how Gabriella shivered, she traded places with her. "Stand here and get warm," she said, positioning Gabriella so that she could feel the warmth of the great fire that the priest had lit and the dancers circled. Their arms and legs gave shape to the rhythms of the drums, the whistling of the flutes, and the bellow of conch shells. The sealskin drums, the bone flutes, the shells, all instruments fashioned from dead creatures pressed to warm flesh to give them life once more. The musicians play in unbroken unison, the sound of their music shaking Gabriella's chest, altering her consciousness so that she felt as if her spirit might leave her body to let someone take its place. "Gabriella." She turned, thinking Eloise had called her name, but her friend's attentiveness was fixed on the dancers, her hands clapping the rhythms of the drums. The line of dancers swooped around the fire, undulating and swerving, an ill-circling an urchin of fire. Suddenly, one stepped out of line, then another as the bodies trembled under the weight of the spirits that were not their own. The gods were coming. There were 14 dancers, one for each god. At most ceremonies, it was customary for 3 or 4 dancers to become possessed by their gods. Once the god had mounted them, They could call forth spirits of the dead to inhabit the bodies of other dancers. Then the living could make requests of the dead, and the dead could answer, granting the request if they were satisfied with the offering made. Usually wine, fish, or wheat thrown into the offering fire. But this night was different. The entire line of dancers splintered and everyone was being mounted. Kimba of the rain, Asaka of the harvest, Ar Soleil of the hearth, all settled into those sanctioned to them. The drummers struggled to keep up, each one trying to follow with the rhythm preferred by each deity. The jumble of beats made for an overwhelming sound. Gabriella's ears fluttered, and her mind felt as if it, too, were shaking with the throbbing of the drums. Gabriella. Or perhaps she was just shivering. She moved closer to the fire, as close as she could without getting caught up in the swirl of dancers. Soon, even the 14th dancer was mounted by Save Mael, the speaker, the oldest of the gods. The music of the instruments grew louder as the crowd became silent. Save Mael rarely made appearances, and when she did, she spoke for all the gods and the dead. Her mask was that of a serpent, her symbol a snake biting its own tail, a sign of her own infinitude. Her priest, whose staff bore the same symbol, rushed over to attend to her as the dancers on either side of her grew completely still, in reverence to the ancient deity amidst them. Save Mael took on the posture of an old bent crone. Her voice from behind the mask sounded strange and otherworldly, tired and full of whispers. "My people," she breathed. The priests and priestesses knelt down. The music went silent. The villagers followed suit and settled their knees into the sand. It was a full summoning. Every god was present. Nothing like it had occurred in a generation. Gabriella felt her own stomach flip as she fell to her knees. Gabriella. She shook her head. The cold was getting the best of her. She wondered if the ceremony would last longer because it was a full summoning. She was not sure she could endure it. She looked at Eloise and Damien, but neither was in as much distress as she. Gabriella's hands shook, and her head hurt as if her metal band were fastened around her temples, and it was tightening. Gabriella. She must have been turning feverish. Her skin tingled. The priests, busy with their gods, had let the offering fire die down. Gabriella could barely feel its heat now. Her clothes felt like a heavy, icy blanket. So focused she was on staying close to the fire that she was startled when the high priest spoke out, beseeching the gods for their wisdom. Save Mael hissed, cutting off his elaborate greeting, her sibilant voice cascading chills down Gabriella's spine. "What do you seek?" Save Mael asked. "Counsel, O most revered one," the high priest continued, his hand shaking on his staff. "A group of foreigners, men, who call themselves the Sevwar, seek the lands about this very tower. For what reasons, we know not. The owner of the land will grant the sale if we cannot raise the amount. It is a great sum, greater than all our stores on the island. What are we to do?" The crowd waited. Gabriella took a deep breath, but the air felt thin, her head foggy. She thought of all the counsel she had heard sought at summonings throughout her life. Which moons to sail under, which days to plant, which medicines to use for healing, even which man to wed. How many aches and pains had she healed? How many happy unions predicted? How could Mab Miller, or anyone for that matter, doubt the gods and their power? Surely the gods would want to keep the doorway wide open to the people of Harkness, to accept their offerings and for the dead to accept their tributes. The gods will have the answer. They must, she thought. Save Mael stomped her foot and raised her hand in a flourish. Her mask agleam with firelight, her eyes dark pools of darkness. "The seller will be cursed and live in infamy if the exchange takes place," she said, the syllables floating over the heads of the villagers like a curse. "And the Sevwar, those whom they serve are treacherous." Abruptly, all the dancers collapsed. Villagers gasped. The priest, caught unawares, scrambled to catch them and carry them back to the tower. Not an instrument played. No one spoke. The only full summoning in a generation had ended too soon. Once the dancers and priests had disappeared into the tower, the whispers began. First, suspicions fell upon the Savoir. They were sorcerers and they had interfered with the ceremony. Had not the gods warned that those who the Savoir served were treacherous? A voice called out to burn their ship. Another man seconded it. But then Chief Salinger stepped forth from the crowd. In the light of the offering fire, he looked regal, trustworthy, and calm. Yet Gabriella could not focus on him. Her mind was a whirlwind. Her ears were filled with the noise of whispering voices, her skin crawling. This was beyond goose flesh. It was as if hands were grasping for her, drawing warmth and life away from her body. Her vision was darkening. She attempted to pay attention to Salinger's words, but when that failed, her eyes were drawn into the offering fire. Gabriella. Now her body felt rigid as a board, her chest convulsed, and her thoughts were not her own. Images flashed, and she could not tell if she saw them in the firelight or her own mind's eye. The voices became a chanting cacophony. The music of the ceremony returned to her. Her body felt like it was shaking, not with cold, but with the very cadence of the ceremony. She felt as if she were falling into a trance herself. Her vision faded and her spirit felt as if it were lifting out of her body to wander over the rim of the horizon to distant oceans and continents. Towers filled to their highest windows with treasure dominated the sky. Dragons and carrion birds circled snowy peaks. Ruined cities rested in the laps of mountains waiting for her to loot them from her perch in the sky. She glimpsed Harkness, her own home, her own people, from a gull's perspective. The island a single emerald on a cushion of blue wrapped in the lace of waves. It was in the palm of her hand like a baby bird fallen from the nest, so fragile, so precious. Herself was finally pushed aside, her mouth open for a voice to come out that was not her own.